Hello, I'm Dr. John Slate. I'm with Relationship Support Network.com's Couples Webinar. Today, we're presenting on the topic of criticism and defensiveness, better alternatives. This afternoon, we're going to be discussing criticism and better alternatives that build connection. While I'm getting ready to set up my screen, think about this question. Have you ever walked into a conversation wanting to solve a problem only to leave feeling misunderstood or attacked? Maybe I'm not the only one that's been there in that arena before. So, most couples don't begin a conversation intending to criticize their partner or to return criticism when they're attacked. Most don't intend to become defensive to prove they're right or wrong, winning a debate, winning a battle. Going back to that first question I asked, why do we criticize or defend? If you'll put your answer in your chat box, I'll look at it and maybe it will be interesting. Why have you in the past criticized or defended yourself? Put your answer in your chat box. Good one, Scott. Survival. Makes a lot of sense. A lot of times that could be earlier in life, a survival pattern that we got into. Could have been an earlier relationship. That's kind of what you put there, Mary, your first husband, whatever. It was a learned behavior is what I'm getting to. Criticism and defensiveness happen when we feel threatened often. We move into our emotional mind. We react, we fight back, we get louder, we might curse. In the past, one of the tools that we talked about was regulate first in an argument and maybe resolve later. Because when we get stuck in our emotions, our anger, our fears, our failures of the past, we cannot think. Have you ever heard of the expression, I'm so mad I can't think straight? I think I've heard that many times growing up, and how a lot of these arguments we've talked about, sometimes small issues become big fights. Sometimes they start with just a simple complaint. Maybe it wasn't intended to be negative. Maybe it was positive, constructive, to make the relationship better, to make our partners more responsible or have a better life, whatever. Complaints are often taken to be negative, though. I don't know if it would be correct to have a positive complaint. I don't know if there's anything positive about a complaint, Yeah, right, Steve. It means more work. Yeah. It also means another failure. And often when I get a complaint, I don't take it positively because of emotional interpretation that each person has to every remark that's ever made. We assume things like consequences. Maybe even we have the answer before our partner even finishes talking, before we get all the facts. We even can interpret silence. One person might mean to be silent because they don't know the right thing to say, and the other person can interpret that as gaslighting, or you're dismissing me, or you don't care about me. What meaning do you usually assign when your partner disagrees with you? What does that mean to you? Yeah, yeah. I agree with that comment. Sometimes it makes you feel dumb. And what evidence do you usually present to support that interpretation? Logic, in other words, like I finished as many grades as you did, or my job makes X amount of money more than yours or less than yours. How does that logic seem to work when you're in a heated argument? Logic, and then the other person presents logic. It doesn't ever bring us back together, because logic and our emotional interpretation changes a complaint to criticism. Criticism, it's never good. It doesn't motivate us to be a better partner. It doesn't connect us. It doesn't inspire us. It doesn't put us on the same side. It disconnects us. What do you think might be under criticism? There might be some things under there, such as not good enough, such as protecting ourselves from threats. So when we're criticized, often the next step is to become defensive. When we're defensive, we're often protecting something, whether that's our competence, whether it's our level of responsibility. And often that defensiveness brings up a time in the past where we failed, where we had loss. Can you remember a time defending yourself before really hearing the whole thing? Before even our partner finishes talking, we're already defending ourselves. Before we know what the full question is, we're assuming we know the answer, and it might not even have been the question. Assume is called, the definition of that doesn't really mean that we're getting to the truth. Sometimes we're defending that it makes me feel like a mistake rather than I made a mistake. So what's the next action that we generally do? We generally counterattack. Even that term sounds like we're going into battle, and the counterattack might look like, well, you do the same thing. What about last week? You're not one to talk. You've got your stuff too. And during that counterattack, what happens to that original issue? Well, it kind of disappears. It becomes more about winning the fight than solving the problem. And we kind of use expressions like you've made a molehill into a mountain, and we battle with the most important person in our life. And this counterattack fully causes distance and resentments get bigger over time. Some people have been taught as a coping measure when an argument happens to take a time out. I've known timeouts to last for weeks, for months, for the silent treatment, the slamming cabinets, the slamming doors, timeouts. Distance is not what we want. We want short timeouts, maybe so you can gain your composure. Short timeouts with an explanation. But truthfully, I really like that to be the last thing that we do, the very last thing that we do, because what a timeout does is it causes us to feel like we're not being supported. When you walk away from a fight, what does that say to your partner? Does it not say, I don't feel supported? Does it cause them to feel alone? Does that complaint to the distance, you ever get in that distant place and you wonder, how did I ever get here? And sometimes in a partnership, one partner is wanting to resolve it right now, and the other person is just not wired that way. Sometimes that other person needs to think about it for a little bit. So that timeout with explanation could be, I can understand what you're saying, but I need to think about it. Can we come back to it just shortly? Maybe that would be a way sometimes of moving beyond the anger to a peaceable time to come back together for reconciliation. And what really happens during all this is, no matter what the argument might be next week, we fight with the same tools and hope to get different results. Insanity, right? It might be that your partner might not be the problem. It could be just your communication process is flawed. Maybe you form patterns together and issues never get resolved and resentments build. That's what we talked about last time. The accumulation of these resentments make a small issue turn into a big fight. So in summary here, criticism and defensiveness do not solve problems. They definitely create distance. And when we bring into it like logic and we try to win debates, that causes distance too. Winning a debate does not bring the relationship together. Understanding brings closeness. Listening shows that you care. Listening through the complaint is what needs to happen. I realize I just said something very difficult right there. Listening through the complaint is not a pleasant situation. I understand that, but it's sometimes the quickest way to end an argument if you can sit through it, and instead of returning criticism or defensiveness, a better alternative to criticism is definitely curiosity. And real curiosity isn't attacking isn't sarcasm, it's genuine concern, and it's seen in a changed tone, in the volume being reduced, in your posturing. And so when you have curiosity, you bring about such different things as, instead of saying, "Why are you always late?" Notice how that sounded and how it's a little bit loud. Try, "Help me understand what happened." Instead of saying, "You never listened to me," maybe you might try, "I really like to be heard, to feel heard. Why do you think curiosity could be better?" When you ask questions or talk about how you feel, doesn't that lead to more discussion? Doesn't it open up deeper feelings? Doesn't it open up real patterns underneath the words that are being said? It opens up past hurts and fears. Actually, curiosity lowers defensiveness and diffuses arguments. Important tool. Why do you think that is? Put it in your chat. Let's talk about it here. To me, while you're putting it in your chat, curiosity helps solve problems because it helps you to understand why the person has their position. Yeah, I agree with that. You know, one person says it shows sincerity. It communicates care. It does. Second alternative to criticism is describing your experiences. Instead of, "Why are you late?" Try, "I felt lonely when you weren't home." Instead of, "You're embarrassing me, go away." Try, "I felt hurt when you made that remark." So instead of attacking your partner for what happened, the event, or what they said, talk about your feelings, not their character. Talk about your feelings, not their character, which leads me to I statements. And I statements is how I feel. That's your genuine feeling. There's nothing wrong with expressing how I feel instead of doing the mind reading thing. You're trying to, "I know what you're thinking. You don't understand me." Well, then explain me. Don't attack their feelings. Talk about your feelings. Another alternative to returning defensiveness is validating before solving. When you think of validation, you might look at one of these statements that says something like, "I understand why you feel that way." And what's often the next word after that is a little short word. Yeah, right. It's "but." And no buts. Nobody likes buts. Instead of defensiveness, I can see I've hurt you. I'm sorry I've hurt you. How does that feel if you validate and say, "but It's getting back into that debate again, isn't it? When you say, I understand, that kind of brings a calm. The threats removed. Perhaps the next move could be a return to curiosity. Maybe it's just a few seconds of space, a pause. When we're understood by someone else, it removes our confusion, our threat, our insecurity. It makes us feel safe. It makes me feel that I matter. Can I validate without agreeing? Sure. Another alternative to defensiveness is own your own part. Wow. Well, healthy couples admit their mistakes. Hey, I missed that. Sorry. Something I need to work on. Why is saying you're right so difficult with us? What fears come up for you when you admit that you're wrong? What keeps you from owning your part in an argument? Sometimes it's our insecurities. Sometimes it's our fears that maybe they're right. But the bottom line is ownership builds trust, and excuses destroy trust. Alternatives to both criticism and defensiveness are being teammates. How can we solve? Not how can I solve? How can we take different actions next time? What can we do? What can be us against the problem? How do we solve this? Another mantra that we expressed earlier in these podcasts, it's better to win the relationship than to win the argument. You know, we can lose a battle and still win the war. During conflict, we become opponents. It becomes more about we, that it becomes more about me in a debate. Whereas in a marriage, it's about us. Becoming teammates is very important. So, identity matters. It's part of that emotional interpretation, is why. It depends on what we secretly, bottom line, believe about ourselves. Maybe that's, I'm not important, I don't matter. And maybe that's not really where we're truthfully at. Maybe it's a pattern we've been in for years of our life. Maybe growing up, we felt like we weren't heard. Maybe in our family, maybe in a previous relationship, maybe at work, maybe with a friendship, wherever. Criticism and defensiveness protect wounded identity. Question: does criticism confirm what I feel is really true about me? So it's very important to redefine who I am because of that emotional interpretation. You know, if an example of that would be if you were to say to me that I was a pretty young woman, it wouldn't hurt my feelings because I know I'm not pretty. I know I'm not young, and I know I'm not a woman. I would probably say, I don't know, maybe your volume is a little bit on the bass side. Maybe you got a little thumbprint on your camera there. I don't know. But if it's not who I am, it doesn't offend me. It just makes me bring up questions about why you said that. If it becomes a little bit closer to home, I might become more defensive. So this redefining who I am, instead of being the critic, becoming the curious partner, instead of being the defender, become the learner, instead of winning, choose understanding. Updating our identity is a concept that I have initiated in one of my books, really in two of my books. In Self-Worth Transformation, I talk about updating your identity and changing your thoughts about yourself is very important. In my book, Relationships Can Change, I say in there often, updating your identity is so important because the life you're living today depends on it. One of the best ways to update your identity is through identity statements. And they have to be repeated often to be believed. In other words, the first one right here as an example is, I am safe. Well, you might say that, but you might say, I don't feel safe. You know, we've just had this argument. I don't feel safe. But maybe if you say that to yourself 2 or 3 times per day, maybe you start to believe it. And maybe your circumstances of your life start to support it. Repeated identity statements help us to change and be the person that we want to be also. And so statements like, I'm safe, I'm enough, curiosity calms, regulate before responding. You've heard that from me. I make mistakes, but I'm not a mistake. I respect to be respected. Or maybe we're on the same team. So, you know, when you think about your next argument, think about what is being said and what I'm saying about myself, what I'm running through that emotional filter. So alternatives to criticism and defensiveness are what we've talked about here. Let me kind of summarize it. Pause, curiosity, validate, own yours, and we resolve. We've also expressed criticism creates threat. Defensiveness creates distance. Replace criticism with curiosity. Replace defensiveness with owning my part. If you have questions, be sure and send me them in an email and we will go through them. And in a few moments, you will be receiving your notes from this presentation, and you also receive a worksheet, which goes further into helping you resolve being the person that you want to be. And so with that, I will bring this to a close and hope y'all have a good evening.